right. Thanks for tuning in to another episode of the War Room, courtesy of YouTube. I am your host, Admiral Sigma Jones. My co-host for tonight, Logic's Finest, is here as well. First and foremost, we just want to give a shout out to our subscribers. Thanks for listening in. Thanks for tuning in. We truly appreciate the love and support. Hope you all are doing well tonight or today, depending on where you're listening from around the world. I am definitely excited for this podcast because we're slowly moving towards one of the biggest events in Germany during this time with Hitler, and that is the Beer Hall Putsch. So we're slowly getting up to that, but I definitely was looking forward doing some readings beforehand and all that. I think for the audience, they definitely are going to enjoy further deep dives into the social engineering and psychology of Hitler and those around him. But before we get started, let me introduce our co-host of the show, the man who will constantly have you to deep dive in these discussions, and that is Logic's Finest. Good sir, how you doing on today?
I'm doing well. Greetings to you. Hope you and everyone is well. Glad to be here.
Likewise. You know, I was telling a coworker about the war room, and I shared with them the link to these streams and everything, and I told them if only you have met Logic's Finest the way I have met him. These discussions, you probably won't find them on any other World War II streams as far as the deep dives and everything. And I kid you not, my coworker came back after listening to a few streams and she was like, there is a lot of arguments from your co-host that I have to say he is very accurate. Like, there's nothing he says that I can't really disagree with. I just have it's like, oh, you only seen the surface.
Well, I appreciate the kind words. Believe me, I just I try to separate observation from my opinions, and I'll always say, well, you know what, I think this. This is my opinion, or what about this? But then, by the same token, I'll put forth, well, I understand this has been a push narrative.
Mm.
However, if you deep dive into the actual facts, the actual written and recorded history, it doesn't support the actual narrative. So, just an observation. Let's look at what actually happened as opposed to what we've all been told has been happening. So, you know, it's easy to argue with an opinion, it's easy to argue with a narrative. It's rather foolish to argue with actual recorded factual history.
Sir, you are absolutely correct. I find it amazing when you have individuals who will try to argue against history, even though the history that we have researched and we're presenting, this has been backed by other peer research and scholars from all across the world. And so when you have individuals that's like, well, I've heard of history in this type of way or that type of way, I just find it amusing where it's like, okay, can you show proof of other scholars and other researchers who have backed this different narrative that you're presenting, or as far as a different side of history that you're presenting? And without fail, they simply cannot produce their counter arguments. And that's where you have to explain to them that your argument is based off of opinions. It's based off of what you have been told. But when you actually dig for the facts and you look to see what is the consistent message from other peer research and scholars from all across the world, then you realize, this should actually be factual. But again, when you're basing off of opinions, as we talk about this before, emotions can definitely get in the way of factual evidence.
Right, exactly. And the thing about that is, if you are someone who understands that, then you understand how to manipulate people, how to manipulate the masses. So people who tend to be in positions of power, they understand how to manipulate people. And the easiest way to do so is to appeal to their emotions. Because anytime, anywhere emotions are involved, rational thinking leaves the room. It absolutely leaves the room. Because listen, I can tell you as a parent, when it comes to my daughter, everything goes out the window. All rational thinking is gone out of the window. So, it is what it is, and I try to be a very detached and unemotional and analytical and rational thinking person. But it is what it is. And the funny thing is, organized religion appeals to people's emotion, not their rational thinking. So then their thinking becomes emotional based on the manipulation of organized religion. So pastors are very much like politicians. They understand how to appeal to your emotions to control your thinking. But I digress.
Sir, I love these discussions because it's interesting that you bring up as far as pastors being no different than politicians. And it kind of tails into our discussion tonight with Adolf Hitler. And when you read the people who were there when Adolf Hitler was first being developed into his party and also in his own way, it's without fail that people of all walks of life were just captivated by by this man's oratorial skills. Now keep in mind, he's still a greenhorn and he's still, this is just, a small version of the soon to be dictator of the Third Reich. So he haven't even reached his full potential yet. But his oratory skills, his movements, his passion with his speeches, we just read in the last stream of how he captivated people from all walks of life. From the guy who swept the streets and everything throughout the day to the scholar who should be a lot more intellectual than Hitler, but even they are being captivated. So it just shows you just how feeble minded the mass can really be.
Here's the thing, right? And we're absolutely going to get started, but you brought up a brilliant point. I don't know, maybe two or three streams ago, in that people people like to point at a cult or any group, and they say, how could people fall for this cult? How could people fall for this scam? How could they fall for this leader? And
Mm.
you rightly brought up the point that, but see, here's the thing: people don't understand in the moment that they're being manipulated to fall for a cult or a scam. And the thing is, any person, no matter how intellectual or intelligent or rational thinking, can can be manipulated or fall for whatever it is that is being pushed on them. And that's what people fail to realize. And personally, I think you made an absolutely brilliant assessment.
Yeah, absolutely. To me, I just find it just appealing of how when individuals will call out like, why is these people following this particular group or this particular person, not realizing that that's why you have politics and religion. If it wasn't for the fact that people willfully are looking for something external to give them a sense of purpose, to give them a sense of what their identity is. If people wasn't as feeble minded and all, you wouldn't have these politicians, these political groups and religious leaders and religious groups and everything. They just go to the wayside.
Uh oh.
Well,
as I
before
as Okay, I'm sorry.
Oh no, go
Go
right
right ahead.
ahead. Go
No,
right
no, no.
ahead.
You go right ahead.
I was about to say before we go deep down that rabbit hole, we'll go ahead and jump into the tonight's discussion with our reading.
Right.
All right. So for those who are following the stream and everything, we're still continuing from our readings of Adolf Hitler, the definitive biography. We are now in chapter 5, section 3. And so right now we are pretty much into 1923 as we slowly approach the beer hall push. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started.
Execute.
All right. So it starts off by saying, in the first days of 1923, a quarrel between the French and British at the Reparations Commission resulted in the withdrawal of the latter's delegation. This gave France the opportunity to solve the reparations problem by force. On January the 11th, French and Belgian troops marched into the Ruhr on the excuse that Germany had failed to fulfill her obligations. This act not only inflamed nationalist spirits throughout Germany, but quickened the descent of the mark, which plunged from 6,750 to the dollar to 50,000 within 2 weeks. On Armistice Day, 1918, it was just 7.45 to the dollar. The last payment of the railway expenses by the Weimar Republic to the Committee of Guarantees for a trip to Berlin had, quote, required 7 office boys with huge wastepaper baskets full of 20-mark notes to carry the full sum from the office down to the railway station. Now it would take 49 office boys. The invasion of the Ruhr, along with the inflation and increased unemployment, broadened the base of nationalism and brought Hitler more adherents. Disdaining cooperation with other groups, including the majority socialists, he organized protest meetings of his own and announced that 12 public rallies would be held on January the 27th, the first party day of the NSDAP. Although the Bavarian police president informed Hitler that these demonstrations were banned, he defiantly shouted that the police could shoot if they wished, but he himself would be in the front row. He was as good as his word, and on the assigned day, hurried from one rally to another by car. Neither during the war nor during the revolution have I experienced such hypnotic mass excitement, recalled historian Karl Alexander von Mueller, who attended the rally at the Löwenbräu-Keller. The audience rose as one man, with shouts of Heil, as Hitler strode down the aisle. I was very close when he marched through, and I saw that this was different from the man I had met here and there in private houses. His small pale face expressed an inner fanaticism. His eyes glanced from right to left as if looking for enemies to conquer. Was it the mass which gave him this strange power? Did it flow from him to the mass? I noted down. Fanatically, hysteric romanticism with a brutal will. So, for those who have been keeping up with our streams, especially talking about Germany in the 1920s, you probably would recollect when the French invaded the Ruhr and caused a massive upheaval with the German people due to the fact that Germany was still years behind in paying back their marks and reparations. And as it was pointed out in the previous paragraph, the marks was steadily losing its value as the days go by.
The first thing that stood out to me was where the audience rose as one man with shouts of Heil as Hitler strode down the aisle. Now,
Hmm.
we've all grown up with Heil Hitler, Heil Hitler. Heil in German means hail. So someone was saying hail Hitler. So from early on, someone, maybe even Hitler himself, was planting the idea of Hail Hitler. So it's all about the leader. It's all about the strong man.
Mm.
So the thought was planted. It's not about it's not about allegiance to the fatherland. It's not about allegiance to the government. It's about allegiance to the leader. It's about allegiance personally to Adolf Hitler. Brilliant. Again, if he's a monster, we understand that, the whole history. But what we're looking at here, and what's of interest to me, is that, you see how a person who understands the power of manipulating emotions to get people to bend to your will. And
Mm-hmm.
what does he do? He was a very charismatic speaker. People get caught up in the energy, and when you're there and everyone's caught up in energy, yeah, yeah, yeah. And look how he look how he rolls and he strolls in, and the people are saying, "Hail Hitler!" Powerful.
Very powerful indeed. And like you pointed out, he under he understood what's going on in his surroundings. The mere fact that you had the masses being upset about the invasion from the French and Belgian troops to the Ruhr, he saw that as an opportunity of, hey, we can gain more adherence and gain more membership by taking advantage of this circumstance, which
Right.
again shows how brilliant, even before Hitler really rose to power, he understood, as you pointed out rightfully, how to play on people's emotions.
And it is very, very important. And it was just amazing how we took like three streams to speak about the failings of the Weimar Republic. The Weimar Republic created this situation that allowed the strong man to arise by
Mm-hmm.
not dealing with the hyperinflation, not dealing with the lack of investment in infrastructure, not dealing with the sky high unemployment, and of course the crushing debt from the war reparations. So they created this situation, and Hitler stepped right in. The rise of the strong man. And so everything is interconnected. So if anyone thinks that this was some unprecedented evil that came out of nowhere from the depths of hell, well, no, because if you take the time to study history, it is literally everything that happened in Weimar Germany, which led to the creation of Nazi Germany, the Nazi Party taking control. It is literally has happened before plenty of times. It is textbook. Nothing new there. Absolutely nothing new.
And before I continue, good sir, something that came to mind that you just brought up, how people just talk about how, wow, this Hitler just rose out of nowhere and just spread his evil upon the masses. Well, if we base off of what we understand now about the Weimar Republic and how it failed the people when it's supposed to be its own type of democracy in Eastern Europe, one could actually make the argument that because of the failures of a democratic system, i.e., the Weimar Republic,
Uh oh.
is why you got Adolf Hitler.
Uh-oh. We've said it before, and I will say it again. When you make this point to be so liberal and so progressive and bend over backwards to accommodate everything, say what you want and be who you are and express who you are and live out, all of that sounds great. But restraint,
Mm-hmm.
if there's no restraint, you see how things turn out. Compounded with the fact nobody addressed the unemployment, the lack of infrastructure investment, the economy collapsing. So again, nothing new under the sun. Germany was not the first country where that happened to, and it won't be the last. If history has taught us anything, it won't be the last, and it has not been the last. We're speaking about the the players and the states involved in World War II. But
Hmm.
as students of history, this has played out again over the ensuing decades. In
Right.
fact, there's one country right now that's about to be invaded, a former vassal state of the country that's about to invade it. But I digress.
You know what? Let's continue on before we go deep down that rabbit hole too. All right. Next it says the following day, again flaunting a police ban. The trooping of SA colors took place on the Marsfeld with 6,000 stormtroopers shivering in the snow. Some wore a uniform of ski cap, brown jacket, and leggings, while others were in business suits. There was a variety array of flags with swastikas of various sizes. It was a motley group, but once called to attention, the men stood as rigidly as if they were elite troops of the Kaiser. Although the police were ready for trouble, there was no disorders. In fact, the 2 day affair turned out to be an anticlimax. There was no push, no public disturbance. Only its repercussions were of import. Hitler's defiance of the police brought a number of middle of the road leaders to his side and drove the University of Munich students down a much more radical path. More significantly, it lowered the prestige of the Bavarian government itself. In his first serious confrontation with the establishment, Hitler had come out the victor. He is an extraordinary person, reported an American writer, Ludwell Denny, after attending a Hitler rally a few days later. His speech was intense and brief. He constantly clenched and unclenched his hands. When I was alone with him for a few moments, he seemed hardly normal. Queer eyes, nervous hands, and a strange movement of the head. His personal life was certainly not normal. He still lived in a dingy building in the Thyerstrasse, but had sublet a larger room, not as cold as the first, if as scantily furnished. It was 10 feet wide at most, and the head of the bed projected above the single narrow window. The floor was covered with cheap, worn linoleum. On the wall opposite the bed, there was a makeshift bookshelf. Illustrations and drawings hung on the walls. The upper shelves of the bookcase overflowed with volumes on the First World War, German history, an illustrated encyclopedia, Vom Krieg by Clausewitz, a history of Frederick the Great, Houston Stewart Chamberlain's biography of Wagner, the memoirs of Sven Hedlund, a collection of heroic myths, von Wittenberg's World History, and something entitled Geographical Character Pictures. The bottom shelf, according to Hafstengel, was devoted to novels, a collection of semi-pornographic works by Edward Fox, a Jew, and a history of erotic art. Frau Reichert, who sublet to Hitler, found her tenant extraordinarily moody. Sometimes weeks go by when he seems to be sulking and does not say a word to us. He looks through us as if we were not there. Though he paid his rent punctually and in advance, he was a real bohemian type. She forgave him this, since he was so nice, and let him use her hallway, which boasted a small upright piano. He lived in Spartan simplicity. His almost constant companion, a large dog named, ironically, Wolf. Ever since his relationship with Fuchs in the war, he had need for the faithfulness he found in dogs, and had a unique understanding of them. There are stupid dogs, and others who are so intelligent that it's agonizing. In this dingy room, he must have thought of his mother and her tragic death, for he wrote about it that year in a poem entitled Think of It. Stripped of its amateurish sentimentality, it probed revealingly. When your mother has grown older, and you have grown older, when what was formerly easy and effortless now becomes a burden. When her dear loyal eyes do not look out into life as before. When her legs have grown tired and do not want to carry her anymore. Then give her your arm of support, accompanying her with gladness and joy. The hour will come when, weeping, you will accompany her on her last journey. And if she asks you, answer her. And if she asks again, speak also. And if she asks another time, speak to her. Not stormily, but in gentle peace. And if she cannot understand you, well, explain everything joyfully. The hour will come, the bitter hour, when her mouth will ask no more. So we see the motherly attachment side of Hitler, and well, let me just stop. Good sir, what's your thoughts on this?
His books are of interest to me. Of course, Vom Krieger by Clausewitz, History of Frederick the Great, Chamberlain's biography of Wagner, and Hitler was a huge fan of Wagner and his music,
Mm.
and semi-pornographic works, and the very famous book, A History of Erotic Art, and of course, his love of the wolf. And what did he call his mountaintop retreat? The Wolf's
The
Lair.
Wolf's Lair.
So going back to the very first reading that we ever did, where we took a deep dive into Hitler's childhood, how this man was born and made, because monsters are not born, they're made. So
Mm-hmm.
we see how, listen, all of us, every person on this earth, we are a product of our environment, especially those of us who choose to say and think otherwise. So your childhood shapes and forms who you are throughout the rest of your life. So even the way that you cope and you deal with life is shaped from your childhood. You're either you're you're either working with what you were shaped by in your
Mm.
childhood, or you're spending the rest of your life trying to run away from it. But either way, we're all a product of our environment. So we see this strong attachment to his mother and how she was mistreated by his cruel, heavy-handed father, and of course his failings in the German army during the First War. But he has books by authors who studied war. Interesting.
Yeah, very interesting. And it's something you mentioned because the next paragraph actually kind of deep dives into Hitler's outlook on society.
Mhm.
So it says here, by his own admission, Hitler was a recluse in his youth and had little need for society. But after the war, he confessed he could no longer bear solitude. Though his room was a lonely refuge and prison, he lived a second existence in the cafes, the salons, coffee houses, and beer halls of Munich. He became a habitué of Café Weikart, next to the Volkstheater, the Carlton Tea Room, an elite rendezvous of the Breinerstrasse, and the Café Heck on the Gallerenstrasse, excuse me. He would sit for hours in a secluded corner of the latter at his reserved table when he would observe the life flowing around him. So before we continue, I just like the fact that he confessed that from his youth, he pretty much didn't care about life, about society. He was just in his own little world. But I think he failed to admit that he said after the war he could no longer bear solitude. But I think A big part of that revelation has to do with losing his mother as well.
Absolutely. And brilliant analysis. And I'd like to add on to your analysis. He would sit for hours in a secluded corner of the latter at his reserved table where he would observe the life flowing around him. Very key, because this man would sit and watch and observe human nature and
Mm,
watch people. And he began to look at people from this disconnected point of view of, hmm, I'm observing human nature. How can I use this and control it? What I see. So we begin to see how all of the disparate pieces that we've been chipping away at, putting it all together. So you see how it all comes in: his childhood, his teenage years, his failed time in the military, understanding human nature, understanding symbology and iconography, and the
mm,
manipulation of human emotions and brilliant oratorial skills, or oratory. It's when you put it all together, you can begin to see where it is that this person came from. And again, not unique. He's not the first. Textbook. We have 100,000 years of recorded human history to show
mm.
nothing new here.
Nope, not at all. And so the next paragraph it says every Monday he would meet with intimates at the Cafe Numier, an old-fashioned coffee house at the corner of the Peterplatz and the Victorian Market. It was a long room with paneled walls and built-in benches. Here at the table, reserved for regular customers, he would try out his latest ideas on his adherents, many of them middle aged couples. Here also they would gossip and joke while eating a frugal supper, some of which they had brought with them. Other evenings were spent at the Dietrich Eckert's apartment on the Franz Joseph Strauss. What a wonderful atmosphere in his home. How he took care of his little Anna. This was his housekeeper, Anna, Anna, with whom he had been living since separating from his wife. Perhaps Hitler's most constant companion these days was his new acolyte, Hafstengel, Hanfstaengel, who introduced him to important people such as William Bayard Hale, classmate of President Wilson at Princeton and leading European correspondent for the Hearst paper, and Wilhelm Funk, whose salon attracted wealthy nationalist businessmen. Together, Hitler and Hafstengel often attended the soirees of Fru Elsa Bruckmann, the wife of a publisher and born a Hungarian noblewoman, who was greatly impressed by the new political leader. Excuse me. Hitler was dazzled by life at this level. After one visit at the Beckstein suite in Munich Hotel, he told Hafstengel that he had felt embarrassed in his blue suit. Herr Beckstein had worn a dinner jacket. The servants were in livery and nothing but champagne was served before the meal. And you should have seen the bathroom. You could even regulate the heat of the water. Hafstengel became a frequent visitor to the little room on the Thierstrasse, and one day Hitler asked him to play something on a piano in the hallway to calm him. Hafstengel found the old upright badly out of tune, but played a Bach fugue. Nodding, Hitler listened absently. Then Hafstengel began to prelude to Die Meistersinger, hoping the old piano wouldn't fall to pieces under his assault. He played with plenty of Lisztian Feuertror and a fine romantic swing. And Hitler became so excited that he strode up and down the narrow hallway, gesticulating as if conducting an orchestra. This music affected him physically, and by the time it had crashed through the finale, he was in splendid spirits, all his worries gone. Hapstico found that Hitler knew Die Marstersinger absolutely by heart and could whistle every note of it in a curious, penetrating vibrato, but completely in tune. Almost daily, musical sessions took place in the hallway. Hitler had little liking for Bach or Mozart, preferring Schumann, Chopin, and some works of Richard Strauss. His favorites were Beethoven and Wagner. He had a genuine knowledge and appreciation for the latter, and never tired of hearing Hapstickel's colorful versions of Tristan and Lohengrin. Now, I like to point out, now some people do not understand just how effective music can be. And I like the fact that this shows a perfect example of classical music. Myself being, a former college student like Logic Fighter himself, I couldn't tell you the days where when it came time to study, if there was any type of music that will get me in pure concentration, but at the same time in a happy mood to study, it was definitely classical music.
Absolutely, absolutely. I grew up with with an absolute love of classical music. It's funny how I didn't take up the violin until I was 12. When I started junior high school, I was in my
Hmm.
school's orchestra, so I actually played lead violin, classical music, and I find it's funny that Hitler, his most famous composers were Beethoven and Wagner, because Operation Operation Valkyrie was actually his creation. Long story short, for any of those who are unfamiliar with Operation Valkyrie, there was a brilliant film about it with Tom Cruise and a cast of stars. Anyway, Hitler's love of classical music. I wanted to tie into something though that these two paragraphs speak about, and that
Hmm.
was Hitler's um, what's what I'm looking for? His entrance in dealing with the aristocracy, because
Hmm.
there's something that happened at World War One. World War One lasted from 1914 to 1918. At the end
Hmm.
of 1918, there were four empires that went out of existence. So the German Empire, the Turkish Empire,
Hmm.
the Russian Empire, and there's another one. I think it might have been the Ottoman Empire. Anyway, across Europe, the aristocracy was in steady decline.
Hmm.
So there were not very many aristocrats left. So even though the German Empire was gone, the aristocracy was still there, but in rapid decline. So the few that were left, here we're seeing Hitler engaging some of them. He didn't even know that every single night they changed into dinner jackets and tails.
Hmm. Yep.
But he did have a love of classical music.
Right. And it clearly showed him how vastly different the world he came from compared to the worlds of the aristocrats.
Right.
And to me, I think that even motivated him more so to continue his path of being that leader and eventual dictator, because I think he set it in his mind that I am going to become just like these aristocrats in my own way, but still up to their level someday.
Mm. It's funny because something that gets totally overlooked about the war. When Germany invaded France, Hitler himself gave the personal orders Paris was not to be touched. Not a
Hmm.
single bomb, a German bomb, was ever dropped on Paris. Not a single building in Paris. There were no bullets fired. There were no bombs dropped. And the first thing he did, which which was wrong. He went to the Louvre and he had the place looted of untold paintings and riches, but he never touched the Mona Lisa, at least officially. But anyway, the point is, at some point, the point that I'm trying to make is Hitler develops an appreciation for art, for history, for music, for the classics. And we see it, if in no other way, in that he gave the order Paris was to be left untouched.
I'm gonna drop this little nugget, but I won't deep dive because go it will go completely down the rabbit hole. But I just want the audience to think of something. Notice how for some of young these young leaders like Hitler and Mussolini and even Joseph Stalin, they started off left leaning and they were all about freedom to the people and wanting to have equity and equality for everybody. But as soon as they gain power, all of a sudden they start going towards the right. So I'm gonna leave it there because I just want the audience to pay attention to that because you know as we get further into the background of these individuals, just keep in mind a lot of them started off left leaning, but then as they started to gain more power and influence, they start going towards the opposite direction, which I find it interesting that hmm, some people in high powers today also share the same particular pattern.
Listen, we absolutely won't go, we won't do a deep dive down this rabbit hole, but I will say this. when you bend over backwards and are so overly liberal without restraints, bad things happen. I'll leave it at that.
Yeah. So shout out to Ace and Lawrence Guy in the chat. Good to see you both. So next it says, infatuated with Hefstigel's style, Hitler would introduce him to all of his social circles as a showpiece, whereas he otherwise kept the different groups in watertight compartments and told no one where he was going or whom he had been talking to, recalled Hefstigel in his unpublished memoirs. He dragged me around from house to house as his resident musician and had me sit down at the piano to perform. Once at the home of the photographer Heinrich Hoffmann, he began playing Harvard football marches. Excuse me. When he explained how cheerleaders and marching bands would stir up the crowd to almost hysterical mass shouting, Hitler's interest quickened. Whereupon Hefstigel demonstrated on the piano how German marches could be adapted to the buoyant American beat. That is it, exclaimed Hitler, and paraded up and down like a drum major. That is what we need for the movement. Marvelous. Hefstigel wrote several marches in this style for the SA band, but his most significant contribution was the transference of the Harvard fight, fight, fight to Sieg Heil, Sieg Heil.
Now, I just want to take 1 second because, again, we've all grown up with it. Heil Hitler, Sieg Heil, Sieg Heil. Again, if you don't speak German, allow me to translate for you. Sieg Heil means hail victory.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? Heil Hitler means hail, hail Hitler. Sieg Heil means hail victory. So again, putting together everything that we have been going through since the very first very first one of these deep dives that we've done on Adolf Hitler. He understood the power of appealing to people's emotions, the power of iconography, and here again, now he's beginning to understand the power of music. And so when you
Mm-hmm.
add music to symbology and oratory to manipulate emotions, and then when you add on, for lack of a better term, a war cry, you put it all together, and we see how Hitler understood how to become an effective leader, or in this case, an effective dictator, if nothing else. Because that's all that Sieg Heil means. Hail victory.
You know what? And you just read my mind, good sir, because here's another exercise of what the audience. I know football season is over, but the next time football season starts, I just want the audience to pay attention to something. Look at the marching band for any college football team. Pro football doesn't really have a marching band, so we're not going to really watch that. But just watch any top football team that has a marching band in college, and then go watch some of the parades and some of the pep rallies that Hitler and the Nazis had back during the 30's. And I guarantee you, you would see so many similarities.
It's the same. It's literally the same exact thing. Why? Listen. You made a brilliant assessment. I didn't make it. You made it. A politician and a pastor are basically one in the same. They do the
Mm-hmm.
same thing. They manipulate your emotions. They control the masses. They remove your critical thinking from the equation. And once they do that, they can control you. Because that's what it's about. Elections are not. People don't vote policy. They vote their emotions. They vote who they like. Organized religion, not not trying to offend anyone. Whatever their religion is, it doesn't even matter whether or not the stories are true or not. It's how it makes you feel. Because people always talk
Mm-hmm.
about, well, I have this personal relationship, and this makes me feel such a way, and I get such comfort, and I get such completion. Great, but you notice they're always talking about their emotions, their feelings. I'm going to leave it there because some people, they lack the ability for separation and discernment.
Right, and we're gonna move on to, but like I said, next time football season start, just watch a top high school foot, not high school, but college football marching band, and you come back and tell me if you don't see the same thing that was going on with Nazi Germany back during the 30's. But moving on.
Um, really quick, really quick. Look
Hmm.
at look at the national anthem of every nation on earth. It's all the same thing. Whether it's
Oh
God
yeah,
Save the King, because God Save the Queen is only because Queen Elizabeth is the current monarch. It's God Save the King, whatever God Save the Queen. Whether it's God Save the King, Queen, the U.S. national anthem, the German national anthem, the Italian national anthem, the Canadian national anthem, they're all the same. Nationalism is not a bad thing. I said it before, I'll say it again. Nationalism is not a bad thing. Like everything else on the face of this planet, it's when you take it to an extreme is when it becomes a bad thing. And for anyone who disagrees, fine. Disagreement, I have zero issue with that. What are we going through right now? Starts with a giant O.
the
Happens every
Winter
4 years.
Olympics. Hmm.
There you go.
Right, and I was just about to say that to show you the positive of nationalism. You have the Olympics that happens every 2 years, and believe me, every nation, if they can, will send their best athletes to this event, international event, hoping that they will come out on top of whatever event they're competing in. Every nation does it.
Yeah.
And to be honest with you, I mean, I much prefer to watch the Olympics nowadays more so than uh, uh, some sports here in America because
Mm,
you like to see how these other countries compete in a non-violent way. That's just
mm.
human nature.
True. Very true. Very true.
All right. So next it says Hitler often visited the small Heftigel apartment in Schwabing, across from the large school where he had done his basic training in 1914. Probably the greatest attraction was Hamstickel's wife, Helene, an American of German descent who was tall, brunette, and strikingly attractive. He came in his best suit, the shiny blue serge. He was respectful, even diffident, recall Hamstickel, and very careful to adhere to the forms of address still de rigueur in Germany between people of lower rank when speaking to those of better education, title, or academic attainment.
There is your aristocracy again.
Hmm. Yep. From the first, it was obvious he was physically attracted to Helen, as much by her warm, quiet charm as by her looks, and he treated her with a respect bordering on worship. In her unpublished memoirs, written 10 years later, she describes their first meeting on a Munich street in early 1923. He was at the time a slim, shy young man with a faraway look in his very blue eyes. He was dressed almost shabbily, a cheap white shirt, black tie, a worn dark blue suit, with which he wore an incongruous dark brown leather vest, a beige colored trench coat, much the worse for year, cheap black shoes, and a soft, old grayish hat. His appearance was quite pathetic. She invited the shabby Hitler to come for dinner, and from that day, he was a constant visitor, enjoying the quiet, cozy home atmosphere, playing with my son, and talking over his plans and hopes for the renaissance of the German Reich. It seemed he enjoyed our home above all others to which he was invited, for with us he was not constantly bothered with curious questions and introduced to other guests as the coming savior, but could, if he wished, sit quietly in a corner, reading or making notes. We didn't lionize him. She saw Hitler as a warm man and was moved by his feelings for her 2-year-old son, Egon. Evidently, he liked children, or he was a good actor. One day, the youngster ran to meet Hitler at the door, bumped his head sharply against a heavy chair, and began crying. Hitler, with a dramatic gesture, beat the chair severely, reprimanding it for hurting good little Egon. This was a surprise and delight to the youngster, and from that day, each time Hitler came, he would have to repeat this act. Egon urging him, "Please, Uncle Dolph, spank the naughty chair." By spring, Hitler felt so at ease with the Hamstickles that he would amuse them with imitations of other followers, such as the affectionate Goering, and play on the floor with Egon. For hours, he could idly gossip as he consumed a cup of coffee sweetened with squares of chocolate, or, on occasion, sip a glass of the best dry Johannesburger wine, after improving it with a heaping spoonful of castor sugar. Often they went out together in public, and one evening saw the second part of the movie Friedrichus Rex. The scene Hitler liked above all was that in which the monarch threatened to behead the crown prince. It is imposing to think the old king would have beheaded his own son to enforce discipline, he remarked on the way home. That is the way German justice should be handled, either acquittal or beheading. Now, I find that last part interesting. And I think, sir, you probably know where I'm going with that.
Yeah.
Now, I haven't seen the movie, but just going based off of that last statement, where he says that it is imposing to think the old king would have beheaded his own son to enforce discipline.
Yeah. So again, it shows you his mindset. It shows you his mindset. It shows you where he's thinking. And the thing the thing that also stands out to me is that Hitler was vicariously through his family was vicariously living out the childhood and the family life that he himself never had.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So he never had a wholesome family environment. So he gets to, through this family, live out the wholesome family environment that he never had as a child and that he still does not have as a grown man.
Right. Which again shows that monsters are not born,
They are
they are
made.
created.
Yes, yes. And again, coming back is it is imposing to think that the old king would have beheaded his own son to enforce discipline. So again, all I'll say is this, again, I know I sound like a broken record, but Hitler was nothing new under the sun. If you study history, every dictator, every strongman, they've been exactly the same and they've all thought the same. You know, um, nation specific variances, of course, but you see this belief here that discipline has to be so extreme, either acquittal or beheading, nothing else.
Mhm.
But it is what it is.
Right. But I like the fact where you stated how history shows that this is a repeated pattern.
Right.
No matter what country you can look at. You can look at Great Britain. They went through the same jester. You can look at Japan. They went through the same jester. Now, you could talk about as far as the degrees of severity, but in some form or fashion, they went through the same jesters. So when you have individuals that want to act like, you know, if somebody does something like this today, how this is all new. This I've never seen anything like this at all. I'm like you're doing now. I'm laughing because I'm saying to myself, that tells me you are not a student of history
Right.
because there's a saying, repetition is the mother of skill. You should be able to see that yes, this happens quite often in the history of human existence.
It is literally nothing new under the sun. You know, I know our mutual friend disagrees with the saying that history is written by the victors, but here's the thing: history is written by the victors.
Mm-hmm.
Actual facts cannot be changed, but history, as what's written in the books, does not always coincide with what actually happened. And
Mm-hmm.
hence, that's what gave rise to that saying history is written by the victors. Because people would believe that, um, here's the long list: Chairman Mao, Adolf Hitler, El Jefe, Fidel Castro, El, El Duce, Benito Mussolini, um, Joseph Stalin, that every one of these men were unique. They were monsters. We've never seen this before. Kim Jong Il and his son Kim Jong Un or Il, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
I apologize for mispronouncing his name, but the point that I'm trying to make here is whether Salvador Allende, Augusto Pinochet, I can go on and on and on and on. None of
Mm-hmm.
these names are unique. If we want to go all the way back to the 1500s, we can go back to the 1100s, the 1200s. We have human history is replete with how these men operate, with how they created, and there is literally nothing new under the sun.
Exactly. Uh, to You know what? Before I go down that rabbit hole, let me just continue on.
Okay.
I was just thinking, I was like, you know what? This could go into another deep discussion. So let me just move to the next paragraph. So next it says the lightning change from sentiment to ruthlessness was disconcerting to the Hastigals, and they discuss Hitler's private life at length. What, for example, was his true relationship with women. One day he told them, "The mass, the people, to me is a woman," and likened his audiences to a woman. Someone who does not understand the intrinsically feminine character of the mass will never be an effective speaker. Ask
Uh-oh.
yourself.
Listen.
Yeah.
I'm sorry again.
Oh no, go right ahead.
No. I will wait until you finish.
All right. So he says, ask yourself, what does a woman expect from a man? Clearness, decision, power, action. If she is talked to properly, she will be proud to sacrifice because no woman will ever feel that her life sacrifices have received their due fulfillment. Let me just pause there real quick because I think we definitely got to talk about that paragraph. So Hitler says he sees the audience and the mass as a woman, and that if you do not understand the intrinsic feminine character of the mass, you will never be an effective speaker. I truly find that amazing.
So, again, I apologize for sounding like a broken record. Hitler understood the manipulation of emotion.
Mm-hmm.
So, I'm trying to think how I can say this in such a way because you know how I feel about that boyosphere. Because there were a bunch of boys crying about women and begging for reparations, but I digress. So here's the thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
A man's job is to lead and take care of his woman and provide for his family. So a
Mm-hmm.
woman naturally will follow someone who is leading and providing and taking care of the family. Now, he relates that to when public speaking, whether it's men or women, that group, they are there looking for what? For leadership. Someone to take care of them in the form of presenting an agenda and a narrative to lead. So the way that he put that in that it's that same feminine quality in that they're looking for leadership, they're looking for guidance, they're looking for direction. Now, I'm going to leave that there because I could go the esoteric route, and you and I know you know exactly what I'm going to say, but I
Mm-hmm.
won't. I will say this, and I'm going to bring it right back. Again, he understood the effective power of public speaking, and what he was really saying when he said understand the intrinsically feminine character of the mass. Someone who does not understand the intrinsically feminine character of the mass will never be an effective speaker. He cut himself short because I can almost hear him wanting to say, to add on to that, also an effective leader.
Yep.
But your thoughts, my friend.
Well, I will tie into something that I recently experienced on the job. So, my current position, I kind of work in artificial intelligence.
Right.
And working for a university, I deal with a whole lot of people from many different aspects of the university. I'm talking professors, IT, um, students, some parents, and all. So it's a whole lot of different aspects that ties in with my job. And I'll never forget this. The director, who is my boss's boss, told me that, and this is a woman, hint, hint, she told me that One of the main reasons that she felt very comfortable hiring me for the position is because I was a decision maker, I was a man of action, and I have a way of interacting with people. That should show you and tell you, for any man listening, you have to have good people skills if you want to go further in life. Not just in the corporate world, but just any aspect of life. And one thing I can point out with Hitler, you could talk about his background, you could talk about his decision making, you can talk about as far as uh, 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 how he interacts and everything. But one thing you cannot deny, Hitler had great people skills. And this biography that we're reading, especially this section, truly shows he has great people skills.
And something else that also kind of led me to want to even dive into this, because Hitler said, because these writings were discovered years later, and the general consensus of those in his inner circle, Hitler understood, and he actually wrote this. Hitler understood the power of iconography and symbology. So he always wanted to project the image that he was a single man. That
Hmm?
way, he felt that would act as an attractive figure to the German women. If he was single, in their minds, I have a chance. Even though the furthest thing could be from the truth, but in their minds, the fact that this charismatic leader was also single, in their minds, led them, held a certain amount of sway over them. And he knew this and he understood this. So everything that he said, as far as, treat the people like a woman, and you have to be single in their eyes, and you're married to the people, you're married to the country, that was all that was all public theater. Because behind the scenes, his secretary Ava Brown was his lady for years.
Well, sir, it's something you mentioned because the next sentence actually highlights exactly what you're talking about. So it says another time he asserted that he would never marry. My only bride is my motherland, he said, referring to a nation commonly known as the fatherland. In that case, Hastickle jokingly replied, why not take a mistress? Politics is a woman, replied Hitler. Love her unhappily, and she will bite off your head.
That's interesting because, again, history being written by the victors, because there are written accounts. So this is not speculation. There are written accounts that at Hitler's um, at Hitler's residence inside the Reich Chancellery building, he would regularly hold screenings of various pornographic material.
Hmm.
So we're just gonna leave that there.
Right. So next it says some of Hitler's associates felt sure that Jenny Hogg, sister of one of his drivers, was his mistress. She was devoted to him and reportedly carried a small pistol in an armpit holster in her role as voluntary bodyguard. Helene Hafstickle could not take this story seriously. Putzi, she said, I tell you, he is a neuter. One of Hitler's closest companions during these days disagreed. We chased girls together, and I used to follow him like a shadow, recalled Emil Morris, who also served as Hitler's chauffeur. The two would spend time at the art academy, and in artist studios, admiring models posing in the nude, calling himself Herr Wolf.
There it
Hit.
is. Herr Wolf means Mr. Wolf in German.
Hitler would occasionally pass an evening with Maurice, roaming the night spots and streets for girls. Since the latter was attractive to women, he would act as a go-between. Every so often, according to Maurice, Hitler would entertain one of these conquests by proxy in his little room. He always offered flowers, even when he was penniless, and we used to go and admire the ballet dancers. The NSDAP became practically a full-time occupation for Hamstickel, and he freely gave out advice ranging from enlarging Hitler's tiny mustache to a more fashionable style. If it is not the fashion now, it will be later, because I wear it. To disparaging his advisor, Rosenberg, for his humbug philosophy. While Hitler usually rejected advice, he did not hesitate to borrow $1,000, interest-free, from Hamstickel, who had just received part of his share of the sale of the family art shop in New York City. Converted into depreciated marks, this was a tremendous sum and enabled Hitler to purchase 2 American rotary presses and turn the weekly Volkischer Beobachter into a daily. Hamstickel's generosity turned out to be a stroke of luck for someone he detested. Hitler made Rosenberg editor of the daily Beobachter, replacing Eckert, who was often absent from his desk for weeks. This position not only entrenched Rosenberg's position as the party's expert on the East, but reinforced the influence of fellow refugees from Russia, such as Skeupner Reichert, a mystery man connected with German industrialists, generals, and high society who, besides serving as intermediary with Ludendorff, was becoming one of Hitler's leading advisors. All of the Russian emigres were fanatically dedicated to the destruction of the Bolshevism, and most of them were imbued with the Tsarist solution to the Jewish conspiracy: terror and brute force. To such zealots, social and economic anti-Semitism were effete and ineffective methods. Only the program worked.
So, if I could interject for one second, so
Yeah.
people talk about Nazi Germany and the Nazi Party, but the Russian royal family for decades had it in for Jews. So, if memory serves correct, back in the 1870s, and then again in the 1850s, 1870s, and then sometime in the 1890s, there were massive nationwide purges of Jewish people across Russia by the czars, the Russian kings. So, also, we have to remember, after World War One, the German Empire fell away. That was the last Kaiser and the rise of the Weimar Republic. Prior to that, the the generals and the admirals of Germany, a lot of them were aristocrats, as were
Hmm.
most of the countries across Europe. Most of your general staff and your admiralty came from aristocracy.
Right. Right. And that kind of shows too where, you know what, I just lost the thought, but it definitely would have to circle back with me once we continue reading. But it's just something how Hitler, his connections is starting to improve his lifestyle when he first started off in um, Austria and all. The man barely had penny or any dollar to his name, but now his connections and being able to good people skills, be able to connect with people of higher society. that too helps to improve his lifestyle little by little. That, I mean, I'm sorry, but when I hear individuals that want to talk about, stick to your own kind and, you shouldn't interact with people from other walks of society or other groups and all, I shake my head because I say to myself, then you're content with being at the lowest level of society because you just don't have good people skills.
You know, I can't sit on this. So, if we open, circling back to something that a point that we brought up, as far as history being written by the victors,
Mm-hmm.
because what actually happens and what's written in books and what's put forth as narrative rarely actually match. So, if you open a dictionary and you look up the word coup, in order for a coup to happen, the people, the citizens, storm the seat of government and they forcibly remove the sitting leader and the sitting government, and they form and they take over. They simultaneously storm the head of the military, remove the generals, and they take over. A military coup is when the military leadership, the generals and the admiralty, they storm the seat of government and they remove the current leader and they remove that government from power. Now,
Mm-hmm.
the last time that I checked, neither of those things happened in the United States of America. In
Uh oh.
fact, the sitting leader incited a riot. Regardless of how you felt about the man, he incited a riot. He then went back to his seat of power, which was the White House, which was never stormed by any citizens. The Capitol building is not the seat of power. The White House is. The
Mm-hmm.
Pentagon was never stormed. Therefore, explain to me how, despite every usage of the word, a coup happened. But I digress.
Uh oh.
History being written by the victors.
Uh oh. You might want to get to the chopper on that one.
Yeah. Gotta get out of there. Gotta get out of there.
Right. And shout out to Mel Mucky and Isa Sama in the chat. Good to see you both. All right. So we now get to section 4 in chapter 5. Um this kind of, as we say, starts to build up into the beer hall pooch, but I figured we knock out this section right before we end the stream. So it starts off by saying the spring of 1923 was a busy season for Hitler. The most pressing need was money, and he set out on a series of tours to raise funds for the party. In early April, he and Hefstigel headed to Berlin in Hitler's rickety Selve with Maurice at the wheel. They drove through Saxony, even though much of that area was under the control of the communists. At the outskirts of a town just north of Leipzig, they were stopped at a roadblock manned by red militia. The imposing Hefstigel flourished his Swiss passport, then announced in a broad German American accent that he was a paper manufacturer from abroad, come to visit the Leipzig fair. The others in the car was his chauffeur and his valet. The ruse worked. Although Hitler said they would have had my head as they drove away, it was apparent that he resented being taken for a valet.
Again, people have to remember the year aristocracy. Any person who was a member of aristocracy, he traveled with his chauffeur and his valet.
Yeah, that's true. Little did they know that the real power was the valet person. So, what a ruse indeed.
Absolutely.
So, next it says in Berlin, they not only begged money, but spent a Sunday visiting the War Museum and the National Gallery. At the latter, Hitler stopped in front of Rembrandt's Man in a Golden Helmet and drew attention to the heroic, soldier like expression. It proved, he said, that the great painter, in spite of the many pictures he painted in Amsterdam's Jewish quarter, was at heart a true Aryan and German. Afterward, they watched the women boxers in Luna Park. Hitler looked on without expression, but insisted on staying for several matches, remarking that at least it was better than this dueling with the sabers that goes on in Germany. Next day, they left home, making a long detour around Saxony. Hitler beguiled the tediousness of the way by whistling long passages from the Wagner operas and entertaining his fellow passengers with impersonations. He would even mock himself by reciting a poem written in his honor that consisted of a long series of ill-scanning couplets of words ending with Hitler. When he was in a good mood, recalled Hafstagel, Hitler would repeat this with embellishments of his own and have us in tears of laughter. Excuse me. Ah, yes, Laughing Dog, women boxers. So actual boxers at the park. Next it says they stopped in Bayreuth, home of Richard Wagner, and were admitted into the festival theater by the caretaker. The stage was still set for The Flying Dutchman, which had been playing when war was declared in 1914. And this gave Hafstagel the opportunity to point out that the original stage scenery had been designed by his own great-grandfather, Ferdinand Hein. Hitler was entranced by everything, particularly Wagner's study, where his instructions to the artists and staff still hung on the wall. On the last day of the trip, during a picnic lunch, Hitler mentioned the monument that they had seen outside Leipzig, commemorating the Battle of the Nations against Napoleon, and then made a comment that disturbed Hafstagel. The most important thing in the next war will be to make sure that we control the grain and food supplies of Western Russia. This indicated that Rosenberg and his Russian friends had been propagandizing Hitler again, and Hafstagel retorted that a war with Russia would be futile. The country to reckon was with America, with its tremendous industrial potential. If you have them on the other side, you will lose any future war before you start it. Hitler grunted and made no reply, but it was obvious that the argument had not really sunk in.
And that right there, World War II has been looked at, analyzed, and dissected from a million different perspectives and viewpoints and everything else. But one thing that every single person who has ever looked at this war is in lockstep agreement with: the day that America entered the war, things changed. And it was only a matter of time, because America had something that Germany and England did not have: industrial might. Germany might have had it had Hitler put the country on a wartime economy from 1939, which he didn't. He did not do so until the end of 39, beginning of 44. By then, it's like 43, beginning of 44, but by then it was way too late.
Now, good sir, I'm going to bring this up because this, I know we're definitely going to talk about this later on in the series when we get to that time frame, but I have to ask.
Yes.
I have to talk about this. So, when Japan bombed Pearl Harbor,
Mhm.
and within 24 hours, Franklin Delano Roosevelt declared war on Japan. Then the very next day, Hitler then declares war on America. Here's my thing, and this what kind of gets me in that what if stage.
I already know.
Oh, so
I already know where you're going.
this what gets me in the what if stage of World War II. Because I'm always one of, when I think of these events, I think of what if. And one of these is, had Hitler not declared war on America and even denounce the actions of the Japanese during the bombing of Pearl Harbor, is it possible that the European front could have went in a completely different direction?
Only my opinion, of course,
Hmm.
but personally, I'm of the mindset of no. And the reason why I say no is because within hours of Roosevelt's declaration of war against Japan, the War Department was ordered to ship troops over across the Atlantic.
Mm-hmm.
So America was isolationist up until that point, going all the way back to President Wilson, even though he was the father of, excuse me, the Treaty of Versailles and the League of Nations. Roosevelt did not want to get into the war because he understood, for whatever his reasons were, he did not want to get into the war. But America's entering into the war. America had to fight Japan. They had to retaliate. That is,
Mm-hmm.
but also he did not want to send troops over to Europe. So I have heard that argument that you just espoused before, because plenty of people have asked the very same question. If Hitler had not declared war on America, maybe America never would have gotten involved in the war in Europe. But the funny thing is, that's literally the war that Roosevelt was trying to avoid.
Mm-hmm.
So
Right.
it it would have happened anyway. That just happened to be the actual catalyst.
Right. And to me, there's definitely were a lot of mistakes Hitler made even before the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. Like you pointed out, Hitler's top naval admiral told him that he needed at least 5 years before he could have a strong navy ready for war.
Right.
Hitler Hitler said, "Okay, I'll give you 5 years," but then come
They give him a month.
1939, yeah, a month, and next thing you know, Poland is invaded.
Yeah.
So that was the first mistake.
Yep.
Then the second mistake is when the Battle of Great Britain. He
Mm.
literally had Britain on its knees. The Luftwaffe was ready to essentially flip United Kingdom upside down.
Mhm.
But then what happened in 1940? Hitler decides to invade Russia.
Operation Barbarossa.
Mm-hmm.
And that, according to some people, say that was the beginning of the end. I mean, some you could say it was the Battle of Stalingrad, but either way, that was the first. Funny enough, no country had ever fought a war on two fronts and actually won.
Mm-hmm.
Ironically enough, America was the first country to fight a war on two fronts and actually win. But yeah, Hitler made so many mistakes, not giving Admiral Rader the time that he needed to build up the Kriegsmarine, invading Russia, and then consistently mistakes left, right, and center. But we can go back to his time, his failed time during the military. Hitler was never an officer.
Mm-mm.
He
Nope.
never went to war college. He never understood how to wage an effective campaign. He never put the country on a wartime economy until I believe it was the beginning of 1944. So the industrial might that Germany did have, he squandered it by not putting the country on a wartime economy. He did not put everything into the war machine. So what happened? The Luftwaffe, the Messerschmitt Me 109 was a far superior plane, but They didn't build them in large enough quantities. And then the factories started getting bombed. The Messerschmitt Me-262, the world's first jet, brilliant aircraft, too little, too late. Didn't have enough resources to build them in numbers at the end of the war to make a difference. Even the Kriegsmarine, and you and I have gone back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. Listen, we will never know the Bismarck class versus the Iowa class. We will never know. But what we do know is, at the start of the war, the Kriegsmarine had far superior battleships, but they
Mm-hmm.
were in tiny numbers.
Right. Right. And believe me, I can't wait till we start deep diving into these battles and all and the decisions making and everything. But already we can see this is in 1923. And Hafstickle is warning Hitler that look, you probably want to hold off on this propaganda with Russia.
Yeah.
And then furthermore, be careful going up against America. That's where the real trouble is. And even then, after forewarning, that very last sentence, Hitler grunted and made no reply, but it was obvious that the argument had not really sunk in. To me, that's a precursor of things to come. And as you already pointed out, Hitler had no military leadership experience. He was an errands boy. That's all he did. He just
Literally,
ran.
he literally was that.
Right. He just ran from one post to another just to give information. That's it. He had no experience of wargaming. He had no experience of how to utilize weaponries and units of masses and all whatsoever. But I'm pretty sure if Hafstickle had told Goering this same sentiment, Goering would definitely, in my opinion, would have taken that to heart.
And the funny thing is, we talk about Hermann Goering. Hermann Goering was a fighter ace. He was trained by the Red Baron. He served under the Red Baron. He took over the squadron when the Red Baron finally was shot down. But here's
Mm-hmm.
the thing: Hermann Goering never went to the war college. He got he was literally so pissed off that the Kaiser basically surrendered. He climbed in his plane and he flew off and he left Germany.
Mm-hmm.
He never went to the war college. So his best commanders were actually in the Kriegsmarine, and you could say also the army. That's unfair because his best commanders were in the Kriegsmarine and in the Wehrmacht in the
Mm-hmm.
army. But so many mistakes left, front, and center that Hitler made. But the funny thing is this: to me, Adolf Hitler was his own worst enemy.
Right.
And what I'm about to say, some people at first they rail against it, but then when they analyze it and they think about it, Hitler gave that war away more so than Germany was beaten.
Right. Yes. Yes, indeed.
Because by
Ah.
all accounts, Germany should have won that war.
Right.
And first off, number one, had he given Admiral Rader his 5 years, there's no way the American Navy at that time would have been able to have beaten that Kriegsmarine that would have been built. No way.
Oh no. And believe me, later on we're going to talk about some of the proposals for the Kriegsmarine, as far as like the H class battleships
Oh,
that would have been 70,000 tons, much
months,
heavier than the
months.
Bismarck.
He wanted to build battleships that are the size of American aircraft carriers now, that we have
Mm-hmm.
now.
Mm-hmm. Right. Okay. Shout out to JJ Wilson. Good to see you, sir. All right. Next it says, upon return to Munich, he embarked on a campaign attacking France's occupation of the Ruhr, but often did so obliquely, as if more interested in rousing his audiences against Jews. On April the 13th, for instance, he blamed them directly for the Ruhr takeover, as well as the loss of the war and inflation. He charged that so-called war pacifism was a Jewish invention, that the leaders of the proletariat were Jews, Jews again, that the Freemasons were tools of the Jews, once more the Jews, and that in fact the Jews were conspiring to conquer the world. So he shouted, Russia and Germany had to be overthrown in order that the ancient prophecy might be fulfilled. So the whole world was lashed into fury. So every lie and propaganda agency was brutally set in action against the state of the last, the German idealists. And thus it was that Judah won the World War. Or would you wish to maintain that the French, the English, or the American people won the war? He concluded in a burst of emotion, demanding justice for the 2 million Germans who died in the World War, and millions of orphans, crippled, and widows who remain. We owe it to these millions to build a new Germany. In his obsessive hatred of Jews, Hitler had gone over the edge of reality. His anti Semitism, though expressed in logical terms, had passed all boundaries of logic. He had turned the world upside down. France, England, and America had really lost the war. Germany was the eventual winner since she was freeing herself from the Jews. If Hitler was deceiving himself, he also had succeeded in deceiving his listeners. Hitler skillfully appealed to primitive emotions, and when audiences left meetings, they remembered few details, only that they must join Hitler's crusade to save Germany, that France must be driven out of the Ruhr, and, most important, that the Jews must be put in their place.
See, personally, again, only my opinion. I state that up front. I do not believe that Hitler was deceiving himself because nothing thus far points to his losing his grip on reality. What it does point to is that he was rather skillfully manipulating and controlling the masses, which he's put together all of his skills, everything that he has learned, appealing to emotions, powerful oratory, symbols, images, music, how to appeal to and control emotions, put forth an agenda and a narrative. So, unless you can document and show that these individuals lose their grip on reality, then no, they don't quote unquote drink from their own Kool Aid. That's for you. It's public theater.
Mm-hmm.
And again, you can most certainly apply that to everyday politics right now in 2022 because
Yes, sir.
nothing is new under the sun.
Nope. Although the sheep will have you believe that everything happening today is just so out of this world, like nobody have ever seen. Like, okay, I'm gonna digress a little bit, but it still ties in with this. I've actually heard an older gentleman that said that he has never in his life seen inflation the way it's happening right now in America. And
Really?
I yes, and I had to tell the Germans like I had to tell this gentleman, I was like, is that so? Well, have you ever experienced inflation to where $1 was equivalent to 1 quadrillion marks?
Well, you know what? You really don't even have to go back that far to post World War One Germany. You could have asked this older gentleman, and I don't know how old he is, but I would assume he's older than me because I remember what it was like living in America in the 80s
Mm.
when we had both a recession and inflation during the first term of Ronald Wilson Reagan. We had at that time unprecedented inflation. I was too young to remember, but I studied the economic recession and crisis of the early and mid 70s, but you've never seen inflation like this before. Okay, I hear you. You
Let's
also,
just say you're definitely correct that this was an older gentleman. This is one he is part of the boomers generation.
a baby boomer. That's interesting. So, as a baby boomer, then he certainly remembers the economic recession of the 60s and of the 70s and of the early 80s into the late 80s. But see, again, America, America's economy historically operates in a 7-year cycle. But unless you ever worked in the financial industry, you're totally unaware of that because again, people don't pay attention and they don't study these things. Just it just goes back to what I said. History is written by the victors, even
Hmm.
when it comes to day-to-day propaganda put forth by the media, telling you that there was a coup when there wasn't.
All right, let us move on before we go deeper in the rabbit
Yep.
hole. So next it says, in the past year, Hitler's platform technique had improved markedly. His gestures have become as varied and flexible as his arguments. Hapstickle was particularly impressed by a soaring upward movement. It has something of the quality of a really great orchestral conductor who, instead of just hammering out the downward beat, suggested the existence of hidden rhythms and meaning with the upward flick of his baton. Utilizing his knowledge and feeling for music, Hitler's speeches became musical in tempo. The first two thirds were in march time, quickening until the last third became primarily rhapsody. His power of mimicry was also put to adroit use. He would impersonate an imaginary opponent, often interrupting himself with a counter argument and then returning to his original line of thought after completely annihilating his supposed adversary.
I have to admit, I'm guilty of doing the same thing sometimes.
Oh, I'm guilty of that too. Yeah.
Because you have to do that if you are going to present a point, a cogent point, then you also have to present every counterpoint to it and then
Hmm?
and then address it without emotion. But I digress.
But see, I'm glad you brought that up, Logic, because think about this.
Yeah.
How can you possibly captivate an audience if you are always hammering the same rhetoric without at least admonishing what your adversaries or opponents are saying?
Right. But see, here's the thing, right? What politicians and pastors do, because again, pastors and politicians they're basically the same thing.
Hmm.
They hammer their opponent, they hammer their opponent, they hammer their opponent, but they don't actually. The thing is, okay, on the one hand, you can say fine, they're putting forth the counter arguments, but are they actually putting forth the counter arguments, or are they putting forth one statement or one sentence
Hmm.
and then painting a caricature and then attacking that caricature with the goal of attacking and insulting and name calling that person so they can then whip up the frenzy of their followers,
Hmm.
as if you want to do for a 25-hour live stream. But again, I digress. I digress. Perish the thought.
Okay, let's move on because that rabbit hole definitely don't want to go down that. So, next it says, despite the complicated structure of his speeches, they were easy to follow, being designed primarily for emotional appeal. Thus, he could switch from subject to subject without losing his listeners, because the bridge between topics was an appeal to some emotion, indignation, fear, love, or hate.
What does this not sound familiar?
hmm Despite twistings and turnings, he drew along the listeners as an accomplished actor will guide his audience through some complicated progression in a play. And remember, folks, your politicians and preachers are very good actors.
Like a shepherd leading his flock.
Yes. Oh boy. Again, I hope the audience y'all catching on to this because we are doing some deep human social engineering and psychology. But we'll continue. Hitler also had the rare ability to involve his listeners in the proceedings. When I talk to people, he told Hefstigel, especially those who are not yet party members, or who are about a breakaway from some reason or other, I always talk as if the fate of the nation was bound up in their decision, that they are in a position to give an example for the many to follow. Certainly, it means appealing to their vanity and ambition. But once I got them to that point, the rest is easy.
Can you please repeat that, good sir?
Not a problem. Certainly, it means appealing to their vanity and ambition. But once I got them to that point, the rest is easy. All men, rich or poor, he said, had an inner sense of unfulfillment. Slumbering somewhere is the readiness to risk some final sacrifice, some adventure, in order to give a new shape to their lives. They will spend their last money on a lottery ticket. It is my business to channel that urge for political purpose. In essence, every political movement is based on the desire of its supporters, men or women, to better things not only for themselves, but for their children and others. The humbler people are, the greater the craving to identify themselves with a cause bigger than themselves. And if I can persuade them that the fate of the German nation is at stake, then they will become part of an irresistible movement embracing all classes.
Now, I just have to ask, and I don't say this to self aggrandize, but everything that I have said and I have spoken, I think you can see here in Adolf Hitler's own words. Is this not literally exactly what I have been saying?
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. To me, and this is kind of ties to what you're saying. This whole paragraph from Hitler all the way down to all classes highlights exactly when I say and Logic Finally say that politics and religion are means of human control. Why is that? Because this little sentence right here says all men, rich or poor, had an inner sense of unfulfillment. Now, audience may ask, what did he mean by that? Well, if one does not have some sense of self-identity or have self-mastery, as I would say it,
Yes.
it is human nature to find your existence in some form of external validation. So when Hitler says that he can appeal to the desires of supporters, men or women, to better things not only for themselves but for their children and others, what he's essentially saying is if you can relate to the emotions of somebody who does not have a sense of identity, essentially you can get them to side with whatever cause you're trying to make.
There you go. There you go. Elections are not about policy. People
Mm-mm.
don't vote policy. They vote their emotions. That's that's why you have things like vote blue, no matter who. We're riding with Biden. You know, people vote their emotions, and they will pontificate endlessly day in and day out about this policy or this law or this rule or this politician or how this happened or that happened, and they jump from topic to topic to topic, but they never address the underlying point, and the fact that you went with your emotions and you're looking for what satisfies you emotionally. Because if you actually looked at any candidate's policy and their record, how many of the people who you have voted into office would actually be there based on their merits of their past performance?
Hmm.
Very, very little. So,
And,
yes, please
oh,
go right ahead.
I was going to just say this real quick, but like when it talks about how he was able to move from topic to topic by just changing emotions,
Yes.
indignation,
There you go.
fear, love, or hate.
Yep.
I'm thinking to myself, okay, you can go with any president. You can go as far back as you like, and I guarantee you can look at their campaign, and in some form or fashion, if it's not some fear of what the other party is doing, or this hatred of they are, so to speak, this group is bringing in these people and they're causing this trouble and that trouble, and it's interesting because in these same campaigns they will, excuse me, they will throw in little bits of fact that will help to, I would say, put an anchor to that emotion. And even though they may not explain the whole fact, because the whole fact may not bide well with their message and everything, but if they can appeal to the audience and then just get that anchor that has just a little bit of fact to it, they got the audience hook, line, and sinker.
That's it. It's pure emotion. Nothing more. That's it. So once you can control a man's emotions, you can control him. You don't you don't appeal you don't appeal to his rational mind, because a rational mind is difficult to control. But if you can control his emotions, then you cause him to think emotionally, and that is how
Mm-hmm.
you control him. Again, I know you don't want to go down the rabbit hole, and we're not, but I'm just going to repeat it. Look up the textbook definition of what is a coup, and then come
Mm-hmm.
back to me and then tell me if anything that is a coup actually happened in January of 2021. No, it did not. If anything, what you had was you had your president, who was on his way out, incite a public riot. But there never was even a hint of a coup. The seat of government was never stormed. The seat of government is the White House, not the congressional building. The Pentagon was never stormed. There was no coup. There was a riot. That is what happened, not a coup. Again, appealing to people's emotions.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. So next it says audiences were always properly prepared for his virtuoso displays by pagan military pageantry. Excuse me, pageantry. In addition to stirring music and flying banners, new features have been added. Roman type standards that Hitler had designed himself, and a Roman style salute. Perhaps he had borrowed both from Caesar by way of Mussolini, but he claimed that the stiff arm salute at least was German. I'd read the description of the sitting of the Diet of Worms, in the course of which Luther was greeted with the German salute. It was to show him that he was not being confronted with arms, but with peaceful intentions. It was in the Rathskeller at Bremen, about the year 1921, that I first saw this style of salute. Whatever source, the salute, the vibrant hails, together with the music and banners, did much to assure the audience that the man they were about to hear was the true voice of Germany. On the same day that Hitler spoke out against France and the Jews, he staged another confrontation with the Bavarian government. He called upon the minister president and brought along with him a former military officer who was the commander of the private army of the Arbeitsgemeinschaft der Kampfverbände, working group of combat organization, a conglomeration of radical right-wing groups. The two delivered an ultimatum demanding that the Bavarian government itself demand nullification of the law for the defense of the Republic. If Weimar refused to comply, then Bavaria must defy the law. This was Friday the 13th, and Hitler wanted an answer by Saturday. It did not come, and the radical white military group held a military exercise on Sunday. It was Easter, and Hitler stood in an open car, arm outstretched as the stormtroopers and other followers paraded past. From the Göring's car, Helene Hamstickel noticed in Hitler's eyes a glow of triumph and satisfaction. After the review, he brought a gorgeous bouquet of roses to the Hamstickel's apartment as her birthday gift. They all had a jolly tea hour together, marked by Hitler's vivacity and wit. A week later, on his own birthday, he was gloomily paranoid. He warned Hamstickel not to eat any of the swastika-decorated cakes, which, along with other gifts, almost filled his little room. "Don't forget," he said, "this building belongs to a Jew, and it's child's play to let poison trickle down from the walls in order to dispose of an enemy." On Monday, the minister president finally gave his answer to Hitler. He personally objected to the edict for the defense of the Republic, but since it was the law of the land, he was obliged to enforce it. In protest, Hitler called for a mass demonstration on May the 1st. The possibilities were explosive, since the day was not only a sacred holiday to labor and Marxists, but the anniversary of Munich's liberation from the Soviet Republic. On the evening of April the 30th, the forces for the radical right wing began converging on the Oberweinsfeld, a military training area several miles north of Munich's main railroad station. By dawn, there were 1,000 men on hand. Guards were mounted in expectation of leftist attacks, but hour after hour passed without action. At 6 o'clock, recalled Hitler, gangs of Reds gathered to meet us. I sent some men to provoke them, but they didn't react. By 9, all detachments from outside the city had arrived, swelling the Hitler forces to some 1,300. They stood in the warm sun leaning on rifles, waiting with mixed boredom and anxiety, while a disgusted Hitler strode around carrying a steel helmet by its chin straps and asking, "Where are the Reds?" Just before noon, a detachment of army troops and green uniformed police appeared and rapidly surrounded the armed demonstrators. With them was a chagrined Captain Rahm. He told Hitler that he had just come from the commanding general of the area, who demanded that the arms be turned over immediately, or Hitler would have to take the consequences. Hitler was incensed, but still withstood the pleas of the Gregor Strasser and others to defy the government and charge the troops. The decision to turn over arms must have been a bitter one, but if Hitler had attacked, his forces would certainly have been repelled, and the fruitless carnage might admit his end as a political leader, perhaps even as a man. He did achieve a success of sorts in the retreat from the Oberweinsfeld. In Schwabing, his troops came from a detachment of communists, put them to flight, and set fire to their flags and banners. This was Hitler's moment, and he boomed out a short speech. This fire, symbolic of Bolsheviks' world pestilence, he said, was only a modest prologue to the day in which the National Socialists would seize power. It was a rousing address that lifted the spirits of his men and appeared to change a blundering enterprise into a triumph. But their elation was fleeting. By evening, it was apparent that Hitler's first revolutionary move was a fiasco. By that failure, he lost many adherents of stature. I reject Hitler completely, exclaimed one former Free Corps commander. He failed miserably on the first day of May, and he will always fail. Now, before I continue the last paragraph, Ace, he did ask a question. He said, regarding the previous comment on the emphasis of controlling one's emotions, I would like to add as my agreement that propaganda and narratives fulfill that control. Well, just one. All right, sorry about that. But yeah, I would say, in regards to that, that really shows you just how propaganda and narratives work. If you're able to get to the emotions of the masses and you're able to keep it writing for a long time, you can pretty much get the masses to do anything you like. Which, as Logic pointed out, the so-called coup that the people in blue try to paint the picture. Well, if you're not somebody that does your own research and actually look at the facts to see what really happened and what are the definitions of a coup, one would easily be caught up in their emotions thinking, wow, that date, January the 6th of 2021, and I'm using air quotes, was the day we almost lost democracy.
That is such an absurd statement. It is such an absurd statement. There was no coup. By every definition and metric of the textbook definition, there was no coup. Number one, number one, your sitting leader was not removed from office. His seat of power was not stormed, which is the White House. The congressional building is not the seat of government. The head of the military was not stormed. The Pentagon was not stormed. So therefore, the two things you need for a coup, the removal of the head of government, the control by the people of the military or by other military officers, never happened. You literally need those two things for a coup to take place. Tell me where there was a coup.
Exactly. Well, let me go ahead and wrap up these last two paragraphs. So next it says, he was not the only loser at the Oberweisenfeld. It was even more of a defeat and embarrassment for the Bavarian government. When Hitler was called to answer official charges of having endangered public security, he replied with an insolent confidence that put the prosecutor general on the defensive. By refusing to be cowed, Hitler made political capital out of the disaster. Rebounding from defeat was becoming a pattern. A number of foreign observers, however, predicted it was the beginning of his end. Robert Murphy, for one, reported that the Nazi movement was now on the wane. The people, he wrote, are worried of Hitler's inflammatory agitation, which yields no results and offers nothing constructive. His anti-Semitic campaign made many enemies. The rowdy-like conduct of his youthful, following his antagonized, ordered-loving members of the community. So that pretty much wraps up tonight's stream. We're pretty much getting close to the beer hall push and all. But before we wrap things up, good sir, what are your thoughts so far on the many highlights that we talked about tonight?
Well, the thing for me is that we see how we we see how it's all come together. We see how all of the ingredients were tossed into the soup, and how it has now been baked to absolute perfection. So Hitler understands how to control masses, appealing to their emotions. He understands how to mix and mingle with the intelligentsia and the aristocracy. He understands the importance and the potency of music, symbology, iconography, story, nationalism, appealing to emotion, and how to use them all, combine them effectively, and use them as a weapon to lead, organize, and galvanize the masses and bend people to his will. So again, he's put it all together. He's put everything into the pie and is now baked to absolute perfection. So now, even though the be all puts fail, like the phoenix, he rose from the ashes.
Hmm.
So again, history is not written by the victors. I'm sorry. History is written by the victors. Freudian slip, right? So his, history is written by the victors. The problem is what is written by the victors, and as pushed as uh, narrative, does not always coincide with what actually happened. And that is where that phrase comes from. History is written by the victors, which is why I made mention of that so-called coup. There was no coup at all, right? The only thing that happened was your president incited a riot. That's what happened. There was no coup. But again, history is being written by the victors. And as long as you keep pushing the lie, pushing the narrative, pushing the story, people will eventually believe it. History is being written by the victors.
Exactly. And I'm glad you brought that about history being written by the victors. See, even in that regard, now I can honestly say myself, before college,
Mhm.
when I listened to some of my uncles who served, granduncles that served in World War II, and throughout, you know, elementary school and high school and all, my perception of World War II, unfortunately, was based off of what I was told
Right.
and what I read in the so called history books. Because again, the history books you read in the classrooms are still based on the history of the victors. So they're
Right.
only going to give you their interpretation of the people surrounding them and even the villains or the bad people. But like tonight, when you read up the background information of these people, and especially coming from information that is totally unbiased, these are just factual information of these individuals, you suddenly start to realize that, the interpretation of these individuals from the victors doesn't really line up with the factual information about these people. Like like tonight. Hitler, for the longest, people will make you believe that he was just born evil. That any person he interacted with was just couldn't help themselves because he was just that evil. But no, 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 no. This man was easily your next door neighbor, was easily somebody you went to work with, was easily somebody who you may go down to the bars and have a drink with. He was an everyday person.
Right.
He can relate to everyday people, but yet he understood of making the right moves and connecting with the emotions of people little by little that made him part of history. Maybe on the wrong side of history,
Right.
but he was definitely part of history.
Exactly. And that is the whole thing right there. Ultimately, everything that we talk about here is about using critical thinking, discernment and separation. Separation and discernment. And learning to take a deeper dive in order to separate even written history and agenda and narrative and propaganda from factual happenings, because unfortunately they're not one and of the same. And even textbooks that are taught in school, and even things that academics say and academicians, some of the things that they say are not accurate. And it never ceases to amuse me how people can be academics at the collegiate level, and they are repeating written history that is literally inaccurate. It never ceases to amuse me. But again, you know, uh, history is written by the victors, and when we look at Adolf Hitler, we see that he understood how to manipulate people and control their emotions, and that's the thing. Politicians and pastors, they're the same. They do the same exact thing. Because once you appeal to people's emotions, they think emotionally, and that's how you control people.
Right. Right. And I'm glad that we're showing the human side of Hitler, especially in this series, to where yes, there's going to be people who, yes, no matter what, they will see Hitler as a monster and all. And believe me, this is not justifying the actions that he did later on or some of the decisions he made later on. But I want the audience to understand that Hitler starting off was just like you and I, just somebody, a regular person of the everyday masses. It's not like he was born into power. And so when these people look at today's leaders, and especially if you're seeing leaders that are rising to power and making changes that's out of nowhere, just keep in mind these two were just ordinary people that you probably met on a regular basis, but they, as one friend had told me before, some people are just wired differently.
Mm.
And so they understand how to go about things that are much different than the masses. And Hitler turns out to be one of those people who was just wired differently.
It's funny that you say that because, um, again, people always talk about the Holocaust and the 6 million Jews who died, and Hitler was an evil and he was a monster, and how could he do that? But again, it literally was not his plan. It was Reinhard Heydrich.
Mm-hmm.
Hitler asked a question to Himmler. Himmler asked his second in command, Reinhard Heydrich. 2 days later, Heydrich put a plan on his desk, the final solution to the Jewish question. Hitler read it and he greenlit it, not absolving him of anything, but understand who's the monster. The person who literally created and was appointed governor general to oversee and operate the plan of extermination of Jews, or the guy who greenlit it? Who's the real monster? So that is the first salvo in why I say you have to understand history is written by the victor, and people are not who you think they are, and things that you think happened did not happen in the way that you think they did. And as you begin to uncover and you understand more and more and more, then you also begin to, as you understood what what happened in history, then you can also apply it to your everyday life in current days, and look around as to the people who are on your television, who are on your screens, who are elected officials or people who are unelected officials who claim that they are civil rights this and they're social activists that and this and the third and everything else. And you begin to see the lies and the blatant manipulation that happens that maybe even you yourself have been victim to and haven't even realized it.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Well, with that said, just want to thank the audience for tuning in for tonight. We're definitely going to be updating our scheduling of the stream, so be expecting some more information coming down the pipe. We're just getting started. We have a lot more to talk about this subject, and we're definitely going to help to bring more of these discussions to the table and to kind of get you guys thinking of things that's happening during this time frame, the early 1920s, going on into the 30s, and how they relate 100 years later in today's time. So, with that said, I'm your host, Admiral Sigma Jones. This is my co host, Logic Finest. Until next time.
Execute.